Welcome to the DCC Museum.
I have to thank quite a few people that without really would have been possible to do any of both days. Starting of course with my wingman Johan Simonsma. I have to say big thanks. He became the Dutch part of the DCC Museum. He has driven countless miles and countless hours to pick up stuff, make sure that everybody was clear on what to do. I have to thank all the volunteers. I have to thank Peter Dutzen. Stand up, Peter. I really have to say, Peter Dutzen, ladies and gentlemen, is the inventor of the DCC case, also the CD jewel case. But not only is he the designer and co-inventor of the DCC shell case that Techmon so fondly and Jan Timmel so fondly called it even sexy, Peter. I haven't heard that in a while. But Peter was meticulous on keeping all his stuff, all the drawings, all the original cardboard shell cases, the tapes, and within 5 minutes after talking to him, he said, "Do you want it?" I don't. Anybody has an idea what I answered to that one? So, and then Johan, there he goes again from Friesland, this time to Rotterdam, talking to Peter, picking it up. And the only sad thing about it personally was that this was in the month of May, I believe, Peter.
Yeah.
And there was no room to put this in the documentary. I was able to put all of your pictures in the Jan Timmer layover shot. So thanks again. What we're going to do a separate interview with Peter about the soft side on DCC, on what his mindset was and how to come up with something so spectacular that has won awards and so many countless precious contributions of people being fond of how the case actually works. So last but not least, before I hand it over to Gijs, thanks again for all the people participating in the Kickstarter project. And also to Gijs, who joined in way too late. I call him Mr. Stress because that's what he caused me, a lot of stress. I was unable to reach him because I left him a voicemail on his phone if he wanted to participate in the documentary, but I didn't give him a callback number. So when I was going to be editing the documentary on January 3rd, when I was coming back from Christmas break, there was an email on January 2nd. My name is Gijs Wirtz, to whom it may concern, and this is what I did, and I'm coming to Los Angeles. I would like to be part of the documentary. So we delayed everything for 4 months, but boy was it worth it. So he's no longer Mr. Stress, he's Mr. Genius, Mr. Mastermind as I call him, and also, Gijs was also meticulous in not throwing away everything. He had all the prototypes, including the 180 portable.
And the drawings of Peter.
And sorry, and the what?
I have also the drawings of Peter.
He has also the drawings of Peter, but then you keep those secretly in a drawer somewhere. No?
You showed me that you had already all.
Yes, that's true. I'm just joking around. And he also had the very few, the very first DCC tapes, the original ones. So the DCC museum became a very realistic museum. We also almost doubled in size just because of the contribution of the people participating in the documentary, and that was of course never anticipated. So that was fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gijs Wirtz.
I'll first try it this way,
Yeah.
in order to keep you awake. And Peter, I found out yesterday that not only did you make the case, but your wife made my drawings, which are hanging in my room for 40 years.
Your curtains.
My curtains,
Your
yeah.
curtains, yes.
Sorry. Sorry.
My wife's a textile designer.
No, it's good to have a proper English speaking person. But I never found any better drawings.
Curtains.
Curtains.
Gordijnen.
What we do is, first of all, try to keep you awake. So if I see my wife falling asleep, then I know I have to do something. What we do is a very quick run over of the project. First 10 slides or something like that. If you have questions, just throw them in. This is a small crowd, no problem. And then we go into technical stuff on how this whole thing was put together. And hopefully we then have some interesting time to do some demonstrations, sound demonstrations. And maybe I can tell you then after that how it really works in recording. Because I learned a hell of a lot in this project, working with recording engineers, particularly of Decca and Polygram. Can you hear me in the back sufficiently? So I had a decent training on recording and what's wrong and what is right. And I can tell you there's a significant fight between the recording technicians, the Deutsche Grammophon and Philips and Decca. And since I worked with all of them, I could make my pick. Yeah. But after that, I married my wife, a soprano, and there I really learned what we're actually trying to do here. So that's hopefully at the end. First, let's go over the project, and you see the question, and who knows the answer? What was the really best?
Failure 2000. I had one.
Or Betamax?
No.
I mean, I won't contest that either Betamax or Philips 2000 were the best recording systems, but certainly not VHS.
No.
But what was the most successful recording system?
VHS.
VHS, and why?
Porn. Good marketing. Porn.
Because they arranged for pre-recorded movies. And that's a strange situation. And in Philips we learned this very bitter lesson because we had the best system and we improved it month after month. And yet it was a major flop. And why is that? That is because consumers, they buy recorders because they want to make recordings. But in reality, they use it for, it's too complicated for them to record. Because it has to do with time shifting, and half of the population is not capable of properly thinking through backwards and forwards, shifting stuff in time. It's too much work. You get, your tapes are being lost and you don't know where you did record it, and it's cumbersome. And they cannot get to the right content at the moment they want it. So in reality, what we found out in the recording operations is that consumers, they do indeed buy recorders, but they hardly use them for recording. Yeah, well, with VHS they recorded a lot, but they never looked it back. The biggest problem we had with the CD recorder was that it was not enough used. So what we found out is that a lot of people used it maybe once every 3 or 4 months, and then the whole system clocked, the grease clocked on the transport, and then it didn't work properly anymore. That was our biggest problem. People didn't use it. Now, yesterday you saw this picture, so we look now in more detail to this playback market and what was going on, and specifically the compact cassette market, because that was at that moment our concern. What you see here is that we sold every year something like 170, 180 million products, year after year. And that's an incredible amount. There was not a single product in consumer electronics that sold at this kind of level. Today we have mobile phones, which seem to do a similar kind of, although maybe today not even, but this was huge. You see at the other side that this market is being flooded with 1 billion pre-recorded cassettes and 1.5 billion home-recorded cassettes. There already you see that the home recording is not really that big, not as big as what people perceived it. Oh, I go backward?
Backwards.
Gewoon een verkeerde knop die gedrukt.
Kan dat ook al?
It's ingewikkeld.
So we focus on this music market a little bit more, and what you see here is how the pre-recorded music carriers albums have been selling over time. Yeah, this works fantastic. And first of all, this is the interesting curve of the long play record. And if you see what the disc market has been doing with this gap, then you see also the reason why Philips could purchase Polygram out of Siemens, who was the 50% partner originally, for $1 gulden. People couldn't get rid enough of their phonographic industries quick enough, because it was a major catastrophe. In this period of time, they were making enormous losses, just because of the decline of the long play record and the CD kicking in too late. You can see that it came only here, and you see this enormous gap. So when we looked at the music cassette market, which is basically coming in 10 years later, and when we detected that it was going over its top by the end of the 80s, the music industry became quite concerned that they would lose basically their main carrier, because at this point of time, you hardly can see it, but we only sold something like 400 million CDs, but 1 billion pre-recorded cassettes. That's where the money came in. And to lose this music cassette business would have created the same kind of catastrophe, even bigger than what we had with the long play record. So that explains why the industry was quite helpful in setting up DCC, and also explains why we had to make the beautiful cassette, as you heard just what Peter did. So I think yesterday you also heard about life cycles, that cassettes, music carriers are basically treated like photographs. They document your life. You probably all remember the kind of tunes you played on your wedding and when you were studying, and all that kind of stuff is basically like photographs collected by people for the rest of your life. And yesterday I heard Mrs. Timmer claim that today young people don't do that anymore because they stream everything. Well, you're mistaken. They have playlists, and they still, with playlists, show themselves off what they like and what kind of people they are, and it's their kind of music collection. So that hasn't changed. What we predicted in those days was that we could achieve this. CD would basically go over its top at $1 billion also, like the long play record. Music cassette market would basically fall down, because there was significant, you will see that later, proof that people were totally and no longer satisfied with the music cassette. And if we would do a good job, we would step up DCC, filling up the gap, and basically prohibit a similar kind of enormous hole in the total carrier market as what happened before. So this was the plan from the music industry perspective. And this made even Sony Music, CBS, cooperate with us, although their parent company told them to do mini-disc. But they were properly understanding that their real interest was, of course, in making sure that the cassette market would survive. Now, the situation in 1998, 89, 88, 89, is basically presented in a couple of bullet points here. We had a DAT rotary head audio recorder, basically a video recorder used for making high quality audio recordings in the traditional way with a CD kind of quality. But it was video recording technology, and it was way too expensive to even come close to what a compact cassette is doing. I think Rolf is going to collect one later.
The original DAT.
In the back of my car, and you can look inside. It's completely loaded with electronics and stuff, and it's heavy. You can take off the roof. The music industry boycott against DAT was prohibiting the introduction Are you sleeping, dear? No, I'm not. And that was not a small thing. Most of you probably don't know that we were lucky to get a video recorder in the market in the first place. Sony has been in litigation over 8 years in the United States. It has cost them billions against the movie industry. And they, in first instance, lost the case, and in appeal they won the case with one voice of a judge in support, and otherwise we wouldn't have had a video recorder at all. So when the music industry threatened to do the same thing, already from the perspective of the incredibly expensive fight, basically all the companies backed out and said, you know what, we will wait for somebody to fight this thing. And that's where I stepped in, because together with Mr. Timmer, I started to broker a deal with the music industry that we would not have limitless copying, but that we would have a thing like serial copying, what you saw yesterday, that it would at least not spread out like rabbits on a deserted aisle, as I had to explain to music industry people, because that made it. The thin film magnetic head read-write head technology was coming to the surface. That's a kind of semiconductor technology, and that was basically, there was a factory already built for it, and it was foreseen to be used on hard disks, which was in that time cranking up the market. Only the people were in bad luck, because the head technology had a slight improvement for about 3 years, cranking up density so that you could record more on a hard disk. With the traditional heads, by the metal in gap kind of addition, which meant that the factory was sitting there idle. Now, I don't know if anybody of you know how it works in IC business, but if you put a factory there, it should be in operation exactly at the day it planned and start producing and selling off, and otherwise you lose money in a very bad way. Most of the time it's the end of business. So we had a thin film factory sitting idle, and that was part of the plan to use that and literally buy it and start making our heads. That's what I just told you. The marketplace, CD growing fast. It was already a mass market, was really booming. Compact cassette totally dominated the market. We explained that. Annual sales, we explained that. Pre-recorded music cassette. And we talked about tape sales of 2.5 billion. You could compare it with floppy disk, also 2.5 billion, and VCR tape 4 billion. So these are real mass market figures in those days. It is a 27-year-old technology, and every household owns 3 products and something like 40 cassettes. The 27 year is relevant because we were absolutely convinced that the price was bottomed out. It's selling from very low end to very high end. In the meantime, I explained to you that also Philips was wondering how to make DET to a success, and basically that was my assignment. Present a plan to make it a success, and the only thing I could tell the board of management, you'll never make any money of this, or you will only lose money. And that was not welcomed, that message. In the meantime, our technicians did see the problem of making it at any time affordable, so they were looking at this thin film head alternative, like that would at least take out an incredibly expensive component out of the concept. But the Japanese were adamant that, as we call it, SDELT was never going to surface, and on our own we couldn't set that standard. So we made the digital compact cassette player. And you've seen it a little bit. It's a cassette with CD music quality and CD-like search options, backwards compatible, so we have to really get into the existing market and jump on the train, so to say. Based on the new digital compact cassette playing but the playing time equals the actual, because longer than an album, Jeremy knows, is difficult to sell. With a stationary solid thin head, digital tracks and analog tracks. Advanced data compression enables CD quality with 2-chip solution and existing compact cassette deck. So we don't have to invent new deck mechanisms. Now you may think that a compact cassette mechanism is a simple thing, but if you want to get it installed into a car, it will take you 10 years before the car people say, okay, we'll take it. Because they first are going to drive around on the North Pole and on the South Pole and in the Sahara and wait for 5 years if it still works before they accept anything in their car. So these are not small things. No major mechanical innovation, match existing price brackets over the full range, copy protection, use low-cost tape, and this Anton Hadley in the past gave the opportunity to the music industry and introduced in 1991, in 2 years' time. Now that was is something we will come back on later. In the market we saw, of course, compact cassette hardware sales decline, but the mechanisms were actually cranking up because everybody in those days was starting to buy dual deck hi-fi machines, so the number of decks was actually increasing. The music market in itself was geared up because of CD. People were much more into music and started to also again more record and look into music. The quality gap between CD and compact cassette was grown too big, and we could see that because 50% of the compact cassette sales were premium cassettes. That's crazy. Normally that's 10-15%. And so people were clearly doing their utmost to get the best possible compact cassette quality. And what we also saw is that the music cassette market was going over its top because high quality repertoire was basically no longer released on music cassette, because people wanted to have it on CDs, the big artists, and so the music industry became indeed quite concerned in those days. DET can never replace compact cassette. It's completely outside the price brackets, but also you cannot make pre-recorded tapes on a rotary kind of system. Then you come into a replication situation, what you find in home movies, but the quantities of home movies that's a completely different business model. Jeremy yesterday told you that you make 100 titles. Now I'll ask you, 60% of repertoire what is bought into a country is local. 60, sometimes even 80. For a country like Holland, what do you think is the average amount of albums that are released and sold into the shops? Give me a number.
150.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Between 100 and 150. Yeah. So when I tell this to people, they say, everybody thinks that music industry works, that's a grocery shop. That's an enormous amount of titles, between 100 and 150, and a few which are selling in 2 billions. That's the big international releases, but that's only very tiny. That's different from movies. Movies are going to much bigger quantities and they have a different setup.
Was not another solution to get a better tape in the same machines?
In which machines?
The CC compact cassette.
No.
To improve quality? Because we're
That
looking for better quality.
We had already invented whatever was possible in cranking up analog quality, but tape hiss was basically intrinsically there and you couldn't get right. I mean, before you get onto a digital level, that's impossible.
It says that we went, and I did the same, buy premium cassettes at
Yeah.
a low price to
Yeah.
get higher quality.
Yeah, but you still have tape hiss.
Oh yeah, even with good tape.
And you still have an enormous lack of frequency range and dynamic range and
Yeah.
a ton of other stuff.
That's true, yeah.
You have to understand that in these days, the top, really high-end market started to complain about the CD quality, that it was not good enough. And they were right. People could clearly hear the shortcomings of CD.
Gijs,
Yeah,
vraag.
vraag, the question.
What about Dolby for tapes? Dolby noise reduction?
Well, we had all kinds of Dolby ABC and all kinds of. But that's,
what was that at the time?
well, people bought obviously Dolby equipped decks and paid extra for that because you had to pay the Dolby the patents. And but Dolby basically is reducing frequency range in order to get rid of tape hiss. But I mean, it's you are endlessly shopping in a too small.
It's a workaround.
It's always workaround and compromise. And then at the bottom is the most important one, and the one which killed us in the end. We believed that the compact cassette technology had bottomed out and that it was impossible to make it cheaper. It was already selling at quantities and over a time period that every major invention had been taken care of. Yesterday this was quickly also shown to you that we talk about two completely different music markets. The market of people who collect and who are cautiously selecting titles and enjoying music, and people who are buying with their feet once a year a cassette because in the car there's nothing on the radio, and or they see something in the supermarket which is interesting. So an enormous amount of sales of cassettes, pre-recorded cassettes, don't flow over the music shops, but are coming out of petrol filling stations and wherever you can buy that stuff. In the United States it's slightly different. There was a bigger cassette market and a lesser kind of drive quality. The CD was also much quicker given away at a far too low price, so it lost its glamorous kind of appeal far too early. So the United States market was a little bit different, but in a sense you see that indeed you have a crowd of 1,000 people, 1,000 players buying only 1,000 cassettes. And here you have a little amount of CD players or turntables buying equivalent numbers. This is the 1992 figure of 1 million CDs being sold per year. At that time we had 120 million CD players in the marketplace. So you get a bit of feel of how different these markets are. And this casual market was the market we were after. But we had a bit of a problem because Peter did too good of a job, so the thing looked too sexy.
Let's keep that in there.
And the other problem was that we completely overachieved music quality. Once we went on that road, we were astonished what could be delivered. We will come into that later. What you see here is a little bit an overview of what the plan was, and basically to make in 5 years' time and on a reasonable sales volume stuff which was completely falling into the kind of price levels people were used to buying compact cassette products for. And well, it's a digital IC package. It's a thin film head which you add to the existing design. Then you have to modify a little bit on the deck, and it's also costing something, and then you make a product out of it with a couple of extra buttons, and then you're there. Yeah.
What do you mean by DCC function?
That's the unit which you can shift into a hi-fi unit or into a car system or into a complete, we call this rack system.
Okay.
So this is components, this is the DCC playing unit, and this then goes into a product, which is a casing and a power supply and knobs and things like that. Now, are we going to do that? Now, this is just to show you that we were doing a little out of the ordinary thing, because you see here that we plan to do this whole operation in 2 years' time. And if you look at the yellow bars, in November '88, we had basically the proof in hand that we could do this, with all the figures and all the technology being tested. And by April, we said, then we want to consolidate what we're actually going to make as a system, not as a product, but as a system. And the system consists out of hardware, so products you buy, tape and cassettes, and music software. So you talk about an enormous range of industries which had to come into action and agree. So the actual agreement on the standard was only achievable by the end of 1989. In the meantime, people were already making ICs, and while the research lab was still making inventions like the passcode coding and the thin film head, the development people were already designing ICs, although they hadn't a full understanding of how the ultimate thing was going to look. And the standard was not even achieved because we had agreed with Matsushita to cooperate with us, so we had to get an agreement with Matsushita. I have been sitting there a month, not in succession, but endless meetings, because Matsushita is an enormous technical company. So you have loads of engineers which come with most wonderful ideas to make it complexer and complexer and complexer, and we wanted to just make a better compact cassette. We had to talk them out of that. Here you have to get your key components basically consolidated so that the industry can make them and sell them. And by the end of 1990, the whole thing should go into the market. That's a 25-month time frame and was extremely challenging. This is today called concurrent engineering. In those days, it was not seen yet. So in the first instance, everybody said this is a total crazy plan. We take normally 10 years for a thing like that. And we first do research, and then we go in pre-development and development, and we find partners, and we go blah, blah, blah. But because of the need of jumping on this declining compact cassette market, and what was anyway going on in the marketplace, we were in a much bigger hurry, and we decided indeed to do this concurrent engineering. And I must say, it was in that sense a totally unique project. I've never seen a Philips crowd all over the work so dedicated, working together without complaining, like I don't have the specifications, I don't have a commitment, I don't have the budget fully signed off, I don't have this, I don't have that. Everybody simply worked. Even during their summer holiday, the chip factory here in Eindhoven collectively decided to skip their holidays and work on, because they were behind schedule. The critical issues, well, you can read them here. We had a major problem potentially here with the selection of the kind of sub-band coding, because it had to coincide with what was being standardized in parallel for digital audio broadcasting. And since the car industry was pulling half of the mobile units, and the car industry was not going to use two kinds of coding or decoding systems in one car, we had to push the whole standardization ahead of what was in the plan, and make sure that DEB would not go into the wrong direction. Now, fortunately, because our success was past, we could convince the crowd to follow our kind of standard coding. Now, what went wrong? Why did it fail? Because although Ralph explained yesterday that we earned maybe something like 500 million on patents, that was not the objective, of course. The objective was to have a new system in the market and make real money. What went wrong, and I must say yesterday I found out that it went even more wrong than I was aware of, because of what Bram told me, is that the plan was to either buy the chip factory, the head factory in the United States from Control Data, or to at least make a joint venture there and make sure that we had control over that factory. in reality, a deal was struck by some director, which he proudly explained to us that Philips was not having to run any risk and pay any money until they delivered the head. They said, we don't have to buy it, we don't have to do anything, we sit and wait, in 1 year time we will have the head. And when we came in 1 year time, there was nothing. Because what Control Data decided, of course, was to not use their prime engineering team on making a Philips head, but although they couldn't sell their first generation heads, they started to design a second generation head with higher density in order to at least jump on the hard disk train with the next wave. And in Control Data, there was a bunch of IBM engineers working, former IBM engineers, who had already made thin film heads for tape streamings. IBM had these big machines where they store all the bank transactions and all that stuff. And there already they used thin film heads. So we could have had people making the heads in time, but because somebody thought he made a very clever deal, we didn't get it. Then Philips decided to, and had to, basically use their own research capacity and make their own head, and go through the entire cycle to come to a head for DCC. And that cost us 2 years, and then we were basically out of the time window of the project. So this has definitely been killing. And it's even worse because yesterday I learned from Bram that after the DCC project, he continued working on a tape streamer for data storage, and they couldn't get the thin film head for DCC they used to properly work good enough. We had a too high, rate of, on the big wafer, only a few chips worked. And so Bram went personally to Seagate, and initially they didn't want to tell the secret, of course, but engineer to engineer, in the end, they told him, well, you know what the trick is, you have to get your mix of nickel and the magnetic metal up to 1% accurate. And Philips was working with 5%. And basically it took us 6 years to find that. And if we had known that, we had the head in time and basically wouldn't have had lost 2 years. So there you see how the real world works. We had a second problem because of the time change, and by the end of the early 90s we did hit, I now realize, the first effect of globalization, which in those days was not known, because up to the 90s every main consumer electronic company would make their own compact cassette decks. Philips made them in Hasselt and in I don't know where, and Sony made them, and Manchester made them. Everybody made their own decks. In 1992, I got a message that everybody stopped making their own decks, and somebody invested into a plant which would produce totally automated, 24 hours per day, 7 days a week, 364 days a year, 1 day service. And that factory was going to produce mechanisms for everybody for the next 5 or 10 years. And to our enormous astonishment, we saw a price drop in compact cassette hardware of 30%. And you have to imagine that by the end of the 27 years life cycle of compact cassette, we were talking about every year maybe a couple of percent price reduction in doing a little bit, some stuff a little bit clever, and suddenly there was this plunge of 30%. What was worse is that we thought we could basically get a separate line in the factory to do our modifications and then feed it back into the system. And the people told us, you're not going even through the front door. we don't want to see you. This factory is a closed unit, it's going to run there, fully automated, and we're not going to fiddle around with your digital compact cassette. So we had a 30% price gap suddenly on our plate, on a technology which still had to grow into the price range of compact cassette. And that's where we lost, of course, the competition with compact cassette. It became far too cheap, and it had another effect that because of decks suddenly becoming so cheap and compact cassette even showing up in children's toys and everywhere, the music cassette market started to grow again. It basically made it survive an extra 5 years. So the whole pressure on the music industry was also suddenly a lot less. And they were indeed starting to question our forecasts on, not our, but Polygram's forecasts on how the music industry would develop. So this was typically the effect of globalization, that suddenly you start to produce for a global market instead of a smaller market. We had another thing which I could blame myself for, but the overwhelming success of PASC is why you're all sitting here, because we had an enormous uptake of high-end users. Actually, the unsatisfied CD users started to embrace a digital compact cassette, but that was of course not at all our intention. We had to go into the mass market, and because it was so wonderful, it became more and more a high-end, wonderful, expensive product. The music industry was of course also not shy to price it like a compact disc, because they like profit. And the other thing they didn't do is it never made it to the real supermarkets or petrol filling shops. It remained into the music shops, but the music shops were bursting of CDs. And every time they hadn't enough. So very quickly you saw that the music trade, which is different from the music industry, was shifting the digital compact cassette stuff, which was standing there initially just as an advertising, like it's there, you can buy a product, you can buy a deck, it exists, we have a lot of titles, so they released something like 1,200 titles over all the labels, and we could demonstrate it's really going to be there and it's going to be a success. You can safely buy your deck. But with not enough shelf space, it was moved very quickly to the back of the store, and I think Rolf yesterday showed you that the Manchester guy never saw it even. And I've heard more of examples like that. What went wrong external? The mass market, we had in 1994 another problem which totally was unforeseen, of course, and that was the parallel explosion of the World Wide Web, because of the first real practical web browsers came on the market, which everybody could use. And in parallel we had the mass market introduction of small color LCD screens, which were going on all kinds of products. And I clearly remember on a CeBIT exhibition in Berlin, where all the people showed the new stuff, that our head of the car division came to me and said, and now I have to show you something, Gijs, which is even much more beautiful than your whole DCC thing, but BMW is not only going to introduce your DCC, but they're going to introduce a color display in the car. Can you imagine, a television in the car? And I instantly sensed this is very wrong, because we're suddenly moving into a whole new era of movable, what do you call this, displays you can take with you and use everywhere. And indeed, the whole consumer electronic industry went crazy. In that time also MTV came into real growth. So the general belief in the consumer electronic industry was, we will cease to use just music products. Everybody will make his music video, and people will always want to have something to look at on the screen, and music is out. And a lot of audio companies simply stopped. Completely, not just on DCC, but completely. They stepped out of the market. So the consumer electronics as a total run into a typical deep crisis because the PC industry was taking over our consumer market for a number of years, and because everybody started to buy a personal computer in those days. So we were completely running into a different time frame. It took at least 5 or 6 years before people realized that the music market is, and music consumption and listening to music is something entirely different from looking to videos and music videos, and that only 5% of the artists are getting the opportunity to shoot a music video, and the other 95%, there's no money for that. I mean, if you're selling 150 titles, you cannot expect to get somebody to make you a proper video. But with iTunes, we have lowered the standard somewhat. And I mean, you can show your dog waving its tail on, then you have a hit. So we were at that time clearly out of the proper time frame. And then, of course, I told you that the music set market started to grow a little bit longer. Now, I have for you, just for your information, a slide I used for a completely different thing. What really happened, backwards looking, from the year 2008. What you can see is that in first instance CD became almost 2.5 times bigger than expected, and that is achieved because we introduced successfully CD recordable. And CD was reasonably well transformed into a portable medium, and you can see the effect. While the music industry was screaming like hell that everything was copied away, they started to scream, by the way, in this period of time. You can see that, and my prediction that it would benefit them enormously. So part of the market, compact cassette market, is taken over by CD recordables, you could say, but not the entire market. Super audio CD has been for a short time been uplifting a little bit CD sales.
You also gave them at the same time as the CD recordable, you gave them the music CD recordable, not just the CD recordable.
Yeah, we have to.
Which was a specific kind of CD, which had a tax in it, which nobody bought because you could.
I have them.
I have tons too.
Yeah.
But you know
why you need them?
Yeah, because of the tax.
If I have to give all my DCC cassettes to Ralph, I have to first tape them on such a CD, otherwise my machine won't do it.
It won't
and then I can make a proper CD out of it on my computer, but before that it won't work. So I have dig my own grave there.
Well, why did the record companies freak out after you gave them that option?
Because the record company have always complained.
Oh, well, that's true, that's true.
They have complained here when the LP sales went down.
Right, yeah.
Because there was too much music on the radio and I don't know what. They have complained here that the CDR was introduced.
No.
They complained here that CD sales were declining because of CDR. In reality, what happened is that DVD sales were basically taken over. All the media shops were storing DVDs, and the growth of DVD, as you can see, is even more phenomenal. And that's of course the other problem we were facing with DCC, is that the life cycles and the introduction cycles are getting incredibly short. And so it's getting a lot tougher to do a proper job. Am I smiling good enough here?
Oh yes. Yes, I'm not smiling.
Everybody still awake? Oh, question. Yeah?
What does TPM mean?
Technical protection measures. This slide was used in a limitless attempt of me of convincing the European Commission to deal with the levy problem. In every country we pay a levy on blank media, which breaks up the European market into still completely separate markets, because every country has its own collecting societies. I will not explain too much about it, but the net effect of this is that in Europe we have missed an economic growth of between 7 and 10% of the total economic activity in Europe, because we cannot develop a digital market. I'll give you one example. Philips and Apple together, and basically Philips first, designed a solid-state portable audio device, later bought by you as the iPod. And we had to stop it, because I really had to advise our management, if you do this, we will be completely killed by the collector societies, because they first let us grow this system and then they will come with claims which we cannot afford. I tell you that indeed 5 years after the introduction in France alone, Apple got a claim for every sold iPad of 50 euros. That was a claim at that time bigger than the whole value of the Apple company. And Apple escaped just out of sheer luck, because they had already a good functioning iTunes shop, which was so relevant for the music industry that the French Collecting Society had to give way, and in the end set it for €2.5 instead of 50, and made a deal with Apple on the iTunes operation. So basically, companies like Philips, all European companies, were deprived of a possibility to again introduce new stuff like iPads. And it's going much further, because all streaming services, everything you try to do in Europe is basically made impossible. Okay, this has nothing to do with this. Yeah,
I haven't heard you mention minidisc once yet.
totally irrelevant.
Didn't it confuse consumers though, when they were
It didn't sell.
interested in
It didn't sell either.
Yeah, but didn't they sour each other's markets though?
We were not going after the market for minidisc, and we should have not been going after the market for digital compact cassette as we did maybe in the beginning, a couple of months, but not so long. As I explained, we should have been going after the market of compact cassette. So indeed, software in the petrol filling stations and in the supermarkets, and low-cost boomboxes. We did an excellent job in convincing car industries to not take the usual 6 years, but do it in 3 years. So BMW was ready to launch the DCC in time, but because of that was delayed. If we would have been able to get the car market, for instance, operational, minidisc wasn't even considered there. Then we would have had the real mass market launch. But we were quite successful in a number of countries, and certainly in the Netherlands we were incredibly successful in at least establishing a good foothold in the hi-fi market. And minidisc was also doing something there, but not so relevant. Sony survived minidisc for a number of years in the professional market. My spouse used minidisc for her profession as a soprano singer, for making recordings of her performances.
Mm-hmm.
So but it had nothing to do with the kind of consumer market we were talking about. So minidisc is irrelevant. And confusion. We had an enormous amount of sign-ups of other industries and other brands. So with every exhibition, we had a shitload of brands supporting DCC. So consumers would see this competition, the software. We had even Sony software, Sony music software. Minidisc was really fighting a battle on its own, with hardly any support. I think 1 or 2. No, it was totally irrelevant. We lost on compact cassette. We simply couldn't jump on the train because of the globalization effect and the delay. Okay, this is the second part. We're going to quickly run over some technology so we can do some interesting stuff. The technical overview is that we would use low coercive tape. It means cheap tape. I've explained to you that the playback functions are dominant in pulling this whole train. So for the music industry, a linear track configuration is essential because then you can, with high-speed copiers, duplicate. And if you have 120 titles of this and 120 titles of that, and etc., you have to basically use this kind of setup and not a rotary system. This is the thin film head when it's finished, with the track pattern for digital, music and data, and the traditional analog track pattern, and we basically rotate the head as we used to do with the normal compact cassette to play the backside. The head is made in this way, like a chip. You have a wafer which is baked into a very expensive factory, and you have hundreds of heads sitting here, and you cut out a bar, and you slice them into chips, and you do a lot of things, and then in the end you have a small kind of chip thing which, from which you make a head. And if that process is running in quantities, you get into a kind of setup what you're familiar with is making chips. And since they trade at cents values, you can see that we basically could grow into a very attractive head design, more attractive as the original head. This is what we talk about mechanisms. Oh, sorry. How do I go back?
Derde van boven. Last view. Derde van boven.
Previous.
Last view.
Previous.
No, previous.
Tweede.
Previous.
Okay. Because people don't know what decks are, I think. This is typically a Walkman deck. That's a very thin kind of thing you find in a Walkman. This will typically be a hi-fi deck. This will be a boombox deck with plastic knobs and a lot of plastic. This has a lot of metal and is much more precise. And this maybe not, I don't know. Forgot.
Car. Pay for a car. There's a slider.
Yeah, probably car deck. Car decks are also heavy and sophisticated, but they're going in big quantities, so once it's being worked out. Now, if you have that kind of proposition, you know the tape speed, you know the amount of data you can put on the tape because of the kind of tape it is. You have a wavelength of or microwave. You do a couple of calculations, and in the end, you come to 384 kilobits per second available for putting your music on the tape. And to compare with compact disc, you talk about 1.5 megabits. So that is 4 times more. So we had a kind of a problem that we had to, and I use the word now, compress. Now, if I tell my wife I'm going to compress your singing, she will tell me, well, I'm not even going to use a microphone, because up to the moment I met her, she said, I have never had a microphone which adequately can record my singing. So this is the kind of way you deal with artists. So we indeed, you saw yesterday, had people like Mick Jagger and a lot of other people flocking in like, what the hell are you doing here, compressing us? And that's where we found out this wonderful term, precision adaptive audio coding. What was it, Hans? Precision adaptive subband coding. Yes. It had to have a couple of complex words, and it had to use the word precision. But compression was basically, nobody wants to be compressed. So we had to indeed fight an uphill battle that this was actually a decent quality. Now, the real thing what is going on here is that up to now, we were always working in this direction. Microphone, you get a bunch of data, analog or digital, and then we start to design technical systems, and we have been breaking down, and all of you know that, this whole problem in, well, what is the frequency range we can hear, and what is the dynamic range we can hear, and what is the signal to noise ratio we can handle, and things like that. And then we produce a system, and present it to our ear. And now to show this later to you, that's not how we hear. These are technical inventions and ways to deal with the problem, but we hear completely different. And this time we were going to do it in this direction. We were basically going to design a music system and use human ears for making the distinction between have we done a better job or is it worse? And so a physiological approach. There is no measuring tool even near the capacity of the human ear. So you can endlessly have discussions about this, but it will still not at all come close to what you can hear with your ears. That's completely different. Now, what is the essence? What we have been doing indeed until compact disc is as accurate as possible digitize the analog wave as we have been recording it. And it was believed that if we would do this with 16-bit in a fixed point kind of notation, then we would have a 98-bit signal to noise dynamic range. And since that was, I think that the LP record was something like 70 or 65 or something like that.
I thought less than that.
Even less. And the frequency range was certainly much less. So they said, you know what, we use 44 kilohertz sampling frequency and 98, and then we are way over what the human ear can hear. But after the first 2 or 3 years, we got the first complaints coming in. People saying, the nice warm, where's Albert? Oh, he's gone. The nice warm sound of a long play record is not adequately reproduced in compact disc. And partly they were right. Because although it was a cranky, limited frequency range kind of recording, it had more finesse on certain points. And what we had to learn in compact disc is that this least significant bit could not be switched on and off in a cold, fixed way, but we had to, what we call dither it, so make it a bit fuzzy, in order not to make the sound go away too sharp. And that was exactly what people were hearing. It was giving a too sharp kind of perception. But initially our technician said that's impossible, people can't hear that. But this was the way we were working. And this is the way we started to work now. First of all, we said, you know what, we're going to use a significant higher dynamic range. We add at least 6 bits, and then we are at 146 dB. Well, I can tell you then we have enough. But what we will do, let's see. I'll tell you first something about here. What we found is that people will are able to distinguish, that we found in tests, up to 18-bit. There we start to lose it. And what is 18-bit? You can read it there. If you imagine a water wave of 1 centimeter high, and then you take the deepest spot on the planet, which is 10 kilometers deep in the ocean, somewhere near Japan, and you multiply that with 2.5, so that way it goes over the Mount Everest. That's the range your ear can distinguish. So your ear is incredibly sensitive, from very small to very loud sounds. And that is 18-bit. And we offer 24-bit, but that's where we start to lose it, so to say. But your ear is virtually deaf when a louder sound is trumping, I call it, a similar softer sound, which is in frequency close. And I first finished this, I think I'm going to demonstrate. I'll do it later. I'll demonstrate you a couple of things. was a special disc which they made on the Perception Institute about masking. We call this masking. And I think all of you understand this probably by common sense and practice, that if a loud car is passing by, you don't hear a very soft passage of music anymore, at least not the tones which are close into the frequency range the car is producing. But there's more going on. You're also, if you have a loud sound in front of a softer sound, and it's very close to each other, you will be deaf for a certain period of time. It's like if I give a flash in your eye, it also takes a bit of time before you can see again. It's also, there is masking after the tone. So masking from higher frequency by lower frequencies is different from masking from lower frequencies to higher frequencies. So this was basically found out on the universities and on the research lab worked with them. But then we have to develop a code to make use of this phenomena and not to waste coding room on stuff you will never hear, where you are totally deaf. So our engineers came to us basically at the beginning of the project with a coding example, and they said, nobody can hear the difference anymore. And I brought it personally to the polygram recording people, and they started to laugh because they said, this is a joke, isn't it? I said, of course. And they could 100% secure point, this is being tampered with, and this is the original. And our engineer said,
Impossible.
impossible. Nobody could hear this. 2 questions.
How did you manage to convince the high-end market?
Playing. That's why what we have standing. Well, there's 2 things. First of all, we had to develop a measuring system. And the first year we had a measuring system in the form of a panel of people coming in and doing blind tests. Now, a blind test works very simple. You play you play the original, you play the compressed, shouldn't use the word. And people have a button in their hands and they say, now I hear this and then I hear that. And we look at their score at the end, and if they are 80% wrong, then you can be pretty sure that they are randomly pressing and have no clue on what they're pressing on. So part of your answer to your question, like the press, some of these guys who were claiming they could clearly hear the difference, we simply set them into the test room and said, well, okay, you scored then clearly that you can hear the difference, and they wouldn't, and then they went out. A lot of them in the end refused to do that so that they could continue writing whatever they wanted. But anyway, that was a very cumbersome process. Very time consuming, because people get tired after 3/4 of an hour, and it is even, we found out that at least 1 or 2 weeks in the month you hear a lot worse than the other weeks. We all seem to have a cycle, and stuff like that. So that was a very slow process. And then the Decca recording engineer, who also made the Pavarotti concert working from Rome, came up with a wonderful suggestion. He said, and I had a slide for that, I think. What you see here is a picture. I couldn't find the right one, but when Edison presented for the first time his gramophone, he did this in an audience and had a live orchestra play behind the curtain and interchanged it with his little clumsy gramophone device. And if you find the piece, it records there was really in the crowd a perception that they couldn't tell the difference. Now, nobody believes this here.
Perception.
But people were totally astonished that you could even record sound. and they hadn't a clue on what to listen. And the Decca recording guy told me this phenomena has happened again and again. Every time when we had a step up in quality of the vinyl records, there was the claim, now people can't hear the difference. When we got stereo, people said, okay, now we are in heaven because it's like real. And then after a while, people start to hear the difference again. And we had the same thing with compact disc, as I just explained to you. This was perfect. No, not
Playing
complete.
after 5 years.
Yeah. And what is that phenomenon? You listen to your CD, maybe 5, maybe 10 times, and then for the first time it strikes you that there's something wrong. And from that moment on you will always hear that. It takes time for you to learn. And this guy told us, you know what we should do? We make when we have a new algorithm, we're going to first present it to the audience in the most cumbersome way, with a very low bit rate, so that they clearly hear the problems. And then now we're going to crank up the bit rate to what we use on the compact disc, on a digital compact cassette. And we simply are going to test them and where they lose track on, so they are being trained first on what to pay attention, and then we make it better and better, up to a level that they lose completely the effect. And then we started to make an enormous progress. And we, by the way, did also produce another product. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I actually plan to demonstrate this to you. I have this app on my phone. Yeah, you know this?
No, I saw the logo.
People know this?
Yeah.
I don't have to do a demonstration. You know how this works?
What is that?
No.
This is also our invention, we solved it. This is the other direction of what we were trying to do here. So here we have been recording a music piece, and we reduced the bit rate to the absolute lowest level, which means that you need a couple of minutes to collect a little bit of data. And then you have still a unique music pattern. We call it the DNA of the music, or the fingerprint of the music. And because it's unique, you can identify that piece of music with this fingerprint. So what we have been doing in parallel is, and the recording industry has been filling up the catalog, is basically making a extremely low, how do you call this, density version of every published piece of music, so that if you collect some data over, I think 2 minutes uses or something like that, then you have the fingerprint of that piece of music. So it went exactly in the other directions. We were cranking up the bit rate, and they were reducing it up to a level that it was sufficiently quick. Finally, yeah.
Is that how YouTube works now, to
Yeah.
recognize when you use their music on a video?
So when you talked about MPEG patents, there are more patents which we sold on the basis of these projects. There's all kinds of spin-outs have been realized. But that was a very clever thought of one of our engineers to said, you know what, it's a unique pattern what we have here. And we don't need that much to find a unique fingerprint. Yeah, that was the last one.
Tones. A masking tone alternates with the combination of masking tone plus a stepwise decreasing test tone. First, the masker is 1200 Hz and the test tone is 2000 Hz. Then the masker is 2000 Hz and the test tone is 1200 Hz. Count how many steps of the test tone can be heard in each case.
Next we show you only for showing that initially we didn't have any DCC equipment, so I went to the music industry people with a CD, and I said, well, I have two kinds of tracks on this CD, the original CD track and a track encoded in DCC quality, compressed. And that was all I could use to convince them. Now, obviously, it only presented everything in CD quality, not in DCC quality. But at least it could show them that it was equivalent in I think. Now we have to synchronize two devices. Okay, this was the CD last one. Now I have in order to convince people, because that was your question, I think at some point something like 120 demo titles, because everybody has his own music and his own kind of reference. Until I was at Milan in France, and when I came back the next day in the exhibition area, they were all stolen. And I have only 3 or 4 left. All the DCCs were also stolen, so that was a good sign that it wasn't attractive. I'm not going to do all the other things because of time. Classical one or good enough?
Jazz.
Jazz. I don't have a jazz anymore.
Oh,
That's why I had a couple of them just they were stolen. Now the last thing, 5 more minutes?
Yeah, go.
And this is all wonderful stuff, and I can assure you that I already told you you can hear up to 18-bit, maybe some person can hear. But that really stopped. We have endlessly been blind testing. So when I had a lot of journalists, of course, who claimed I can hear the difference because they can write another story. But once they were prepared to go into a blind test and basically show them, a lot of them were not prepared to do that, and they could continue writing, which was fine for us because the more they write about the stuff, the more people see about DCC. Yeah. So that was not a problem. But the whole exercise is superseded by the Super Audio CD, which I've also done after that. And there we learned something in addition to what we already heard on DCC. You mentioned Minidisc. Minidisc made an enormous mistake in their race to get the product on the market. And they used a version where they compressed the left and the right channel independently. And the funny thing was that they used a lot of demonstration music, a lot of rock music, and people liked it very much, and it got a very high score in the opinions. But when I noticed the demonstration, there was not a person listening longer than 3-4 minutes to the mini-disc music, and then they got crazy. And when we really looked at it, we realized that the stereo image was flying around like crazy, because if you start to process a left and right channel independently, you get very crazy results. And that's, of course, something I learned from a lot of audiophiles, is that you are looking with your eye, with your ears, very precisely where the music is coming from. I do at night sometimes this exercise that when the mosquito comes over, can I grab it in the dark by just listening? It's an interesting exercise, but you would be surprised how accurately you can locate the source of sound. That's how blind people actually walk through the city. They know exactly from the reflections and everything on where they are, what's coming. So you have to process the left and the right channel very accurately. With Super Audio CD, we went basically into this level of quality of digital audio concept, but we started to process the sound there for 5 channels and make actually a kind of a hologram of sound. So when you hear the difference between the CD and the super audio CD, you suddenly hear the depth of the sound image, as if you're looking into a hologram. All those things you can hear. And when we were testing initially and presenting test results to people in the conservatorium, they could easily hear the differences, and our people didn't have a clue on how, and they said, yeah, well, this piano sounds completely different from that piano and from that. They listened to the music in a completely different way from our technical guys. They hear the timbre, the liveliness of what the instrument is producing. And that's, of course, the essence.